Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this, our fourth Community Wealth Building Open Learning event, focusing on inclusive ownership. My name is Liz McEntee, and I'm the chair of EDAS, and I'll be hosting today's session. As ever, it's great to see such a good attendance, so welcome everybody. And also to say that we have an excellent lineup of speakers this afternoon, all with expertise in this theme and spanning key community ownership infrastructure organisations across Scotland. And this includes the Scottish Land Commission, Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise and Renfrewshire Council. We'll also have a brief overview at the outset on community ownership from our expert and regular contributor and lead from the Scottish Government at these events, Neil McEnroy. And through our speakers, we'll be considering the extent to which Scots have the opportunity to own land and or property, and therefore are able to increase ownership and their stake in the Scottish economy. Specifically, we'll be looking at how things stand currently with this issue, the challenges and opportunities that exist, and examples of where progress is already being made. As usual, we ask that you use the chat box to raise any interesting points, as we're packing an awful lot into this session. But our speakers will also be able to view the chat box and respond to any points or questions that you raise here. It's likely that I'll only be able to take perhaps one burning question following each of the speaker contributions if we're to stay to time today. So I hope you can go with that. However, to begin, we're going to include a special feature picking up on our last community wealth building session, as we're starting with an introduction on anchor organisations from Jamila Hines-Brough. Jamila is Mayoral Head of Delivery at Greater London Authority, and as she was unable to attend our last event, we've included her to kick off today's event, as we're really keen you don't miss out on her contribution. So without further delay, Jamila, can I ask that you come to the screen? And I'm not sure, have you got slides that you're sharing for this presentation? No. Or you're just going to speak to us? That's great. Okay, well, welcome, Jamila. Really delighted that you're able to be here with us today and to pick up. So there's actually a continuity from our last session on anchor organisations. Over to you.
Great, well, thank you, and thanks very much for having me. It's great to join you and to talk through this important subject. So, as I said, I don't have any slides. I'm just going to speak for a few minutes, probably not the full 15 that I have allocated on the agenda. So you might make a bit of time back there, but let's see, and then we'll of course leave some time for some questions at the end. So as you said, I am the Mayoral Head of Delivery in the Mayor's Office at the Greater London Authority. And just really briefly, what that entails is I kind of oversee making sure that the Mayor's priorities happen. So he of course has a manifesto and has within that a set of key priorities, that he really wants to see through for Londoners, and it's essentially my job to kind of help make sure that happens. So it's a bit of an anything and everything job, really, but sort of programme oversight and a bit of sort of policy oversight as well, just to put that in context. So what I thought I would do today is talk through the approach that we've taken to the Anchor Institutions network in London, by providing a little bit of context, first of all, for where it's situated, because it actually isn't owned as such by the Mayor of London or by the Greater London Authority. We've really enabled the network to happen and to take off, but we very much are not in the driving seat. It is a network of those organisations that have come together, and they really sort of, the intention anyway, and I'll come back to why it might be the distinction between the intention and the reality at the moment, is that the network is kind of driving itself. But first of all, the context and the London Recovery Programme. So obviously, pandemic. In response to the pandemic, London brought together the London Recovery Board, which is the Greater London Authority, Mayor of London's office, but also all of the boroughs in London. There are 33, and a number of other key London institutions. And they really came together to coordinate and drive the capital's response to recovery from the pandemic. And this is actually quite noteworthy because governance in London has historically been quite fractured, as you sort of may or may not know. The mayoralty is obviously relatively new in sort of the grand scheme of things, 20 years or so. And the powers that we have are as distinct to the powers that the boroughs have, and we haven't always played as nicely together as we possibly should have done. So bringing together the London Recovery Board has been a real game changer, actually, in driving and fostering that collaboration and coordination between the institutions kind of running London. But it isn't just the GLA and the boroughs, it's also institutions like the Met Police, TfL, some of London's voluntary and community sector organisations like London Chamber of Commerce, who all come together and sit on the board. The NHS in London is also part of that London Recovery Board, and they have been really key to our work on anchor institutions. It was essentially the NHS and Sir David Sloman specifically, who chairs the NHS in London, who approached the London Recovery Board with the proposal that an anchor institutions network would be a good way of driving some of the economic and social recovery ambitions that the board was setting out. So that was where it sort of began, really, was Sir David coming to the board and saying, I think there's something in this, and I think that we should look at this. Chaired by Sir David, we pulled together a task and finish group to identify just some of the basics, what an anchor institutions network would look like, what it might do, who it should involve, what it should work on, but whether it would cover a whole range of the economic and social policy objectives that the London Recovery Board oversees, or whether it should have a set of priorities within those. And as a result of those initial conversations, we developed a charter which set out quite clearly what the overarching principles for such a network might be. So this was really kind of the initial kickoff phase, something that said we think there is scope to bring together some of these key organisations in London to achieve a limited set of objectives, and they were around employment opportunities, young people, procurement, and Green New Deal, so environmental policies. That initial charter was signed up to by 14 organisations, and I should actually say at this point that not all of those organisations really would be described classically as anchor organisations. I know that for some, an anchor organisation is not a private sector body; it's very much public sector. But that's not the approach that we have taken in London. There are private sector organisations on the charter, but the thing that we think defines them as anchors is that sense of really being rooted in place and kind of having that very sort of geographical link, basically, and to the local community. So their activity being as distinct to sort of what you might consider classic CSR type activity. We've also been working with some consultants, so Bloomberg Associates from New York have been on a pro bono basis, really helping to pull together and drive the network. And the kind of external challenge, I guess, and expertise that they have provided has been really valuable in helping to bring the network together. So I'll say a bit about governance and structure next. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's the approach that we've taken is very much not to try to lead the network or the programme from within the Mayor's office. It felt that wouldn't be right, and that actually, having set out the key set of priorities and the areas on which we thought the anchors could best add value, it would be better if then the network really kind of drives itself and is chaired by members from within the network. So NHS London and the University of London chair the network, and the Mayor of London's office and the GLA sit on a steering group and contribute that way. So that distinction did feel quite important to us. Whilst I'm sure that it wouldn't have happened and taken off in the same way were it not for the priority and the time and the capacity that the Mayor has afforded it. It felt really important that it wasn't us driving it. But just in terms of some of that context, it is true to say that I think the Mayor really saw the work of the Anchors Network as an opportunity to help deliver on some of his own priorities and his objectives. So things around economic fairness, responsible procurement, working with these organisations was clearly an important and an important tool to help deliver on those, and one that we just wouldn't have access to our kind of ourselves. It felt like an important lever essentially to deliver on a set of mayoral priorities, and that's part of the reason that he has afforded such kind of time capacity and energy in making the network happen. So I've mentioned the steering committee. I'll set out briefly the working groups that sit underneath the steering committee and oversee activity on each of the priority areas that have been identified. There's one on procurement, there's one on hiring and skills, there's one on youth mentoring or opportunities for young people, on Green New Deal, as I mentioned, and then a couple of cross-cutting pieces around place-based activity and impact reporting. So just before I finish, I'll reflect a bit on what it feels is working well and perhaps what hasn't been working as well, and some of the areas that we might look to tweak as we move forward. In terms of what's working well, within just a year, the network has enabled some really quite significant commitments from the organisations involved, which will have a significant impact on London's economy. So all of the organisations involved have committed to spending 20 to 30% of their procurement spend on SMEs and voluntary and community sector enterprises. So I'm going to forget the number off the top of my head now, but it's something like 1.3 billion of spend that roughly adds up to over the course of a few years, which is clearly significant and something that wouldn't have happened without the activities of the network. Some things that have been more challenging are around progressing beyond what I would call headline commitments. So to give you an example on the youth mentoring stuff, the youth working group and the members that are involved in that have committed to ensuring that what we call the young people most in need, those who experience various different barriers, like having been part of the care system, like low income, like asylum or refugee status, etc., etc. There's roughly 100,000 of those young people in London. As a sort of collective ambition, the group has signed up to ensuring that all of those young people have access to kind of tailored, personalised mentoring support. Getting beyond that collective ambition, though, has proved extremely challenging. So individual commitments from individual anchor organisations that would express their specific contribution to that overall target has been really challenging to achieve. And this is sort of, a year on from the beginning of our work on the network and the signing of the charter. We're still working out what those individual pieces, individual commitments might be. So that's definitely proved a challenge there. Also, the point that I've touched on a couple of times already about the Anchors Network leading itself, there is a tension between having a single nominated lead person or lead organisation rather who can drive activity and make it happen versus wanting the anchors themselves to identify where they can best add value and sort of contribute where they think feels most appropriate that way. So it's been slower than it would have been had the mayor just said, I need someone from my office to run this and make it happen. And that, that tension is kind of still playing itself out for us. I'll stop there. That was a quite quick canter through, I realise, and happy to clarify anything that didn't make sense and answer any questions.
Jamila, thanks so much. That was really interesting, and I wasn't aware of the programme work you were taking forward before today, really, or this session. So it's really impressive and ambitious. But nonetheless, I can recognise, I think, some of the challenges that you're describing there for other contexts that we have here in Scotland. I'm looking at the chat box and I can't see any burning questions coming through for you. Neil, is there anything you would like to ask Jamila before we move on to the main body of the programme?
Yeah, surely. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Jamila. I'm wondering, what would you say is the biggest policy area that across London that's being advanced according to the anchor work? Where is it starting to kind of make a big push, if you like, in policy terms at the Greater London level? Because it's always important, isn't it, the anchor work starts to dig into mainstream policy and really start to turn the dial. So where would you say it's doing best at the moment, and where could it go, if you like, moving towards the future?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. That's a good question. I think that the stuff around hiring and skills, so specifically looking at what the sort of proportions of individuals from particular backgrounds, you're thinking about diversity. I hate to use the word targets because it feels so contentious, but making sure that employers are really thinking about and advancing their inclusive employment practices is where it feels like there's been some really significant traction. Actually, it's kind of, as I alluded to before, the mayor has since he's been in post, since 2016, has had a very clear set of policy priorities around inclusive employment. But what the Anchors Network has enabled is a much wider conversation about what what reasonable expectations of employers should be, and it takes it beyond the mayor acting as an advocate or championing his particular sort of charter or or whatever it might be. It takes it into a whole different realm around these organisations looking at their own practices and policies, and really pushing the dial on what feels doable for them. The sorts of conversations that we've been having about what feels possible and manageable from their perspective has definitely progressed quite significantly, I'd say, as a result of the work on the network.
That's great, Jamila. Thank you. We do have a couple of questions in the Anchor, the chat box about. First one's from Mags here, who's going to be speaking later. But what's the average size of the Anchor entity in the network? I don't know if you picked that up, Jamila. Can you share that?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question to answer because it varies massively. So the average probably isn't actually a useful measure for you. So to give you an example of what I mean by that, the NHS in London, I'm not going to pull a figure out because I'll get it wrong, but you can imagine the sort of size of individuals working for the NHS in London. That's at the larger end. The Metropolitan Police, for example, that's at the larger end. But then we also have Film London involved. Now, actually, that's an umbrella body. Their head office probably employs no more than 25 people. So that's a very different category, I guess. But the way in which they operate as an anchor is to sort of corral and coordinate all of those organisations that are part of them as a membership body. So once you start counting that number, then that starts to take on a whole different scale of significance. So no specific numbers there, but I hope that gives you a sort of sense of what we're talking about.
The question should probably be what's the range, in a sense, as you say, there's kind of the much larger organisations versus the smaller ones. And we've also got a question from James King. Are there any links to the website or documents, for example, the charter that you're describing, and also the working objectives work streams? I'm thinking that's obvious. Again, it's always helpful to have, kind of templates, frameworks, previous material if you're looking to develop these things in your own area. Could we perhaps gather that, folks, and maybe from you, Jamila, and share it as part of this follow-up to our event today?
Yeah, I'd be very happy to pop in the chat the link to. They have their own website. There is an Anchored Institutions in London website. There is also, for anybody who has a few hours here and there to spare, I would actually suggest that it's really worthwhile watching back some of the London Recovery Board meetings at which this was first discussed. So I think it would be, let's say, the November 2020 Recovery Board. And again, I will find a link and put it in the chat. That is when things like the charter was, that's where it was being developed and where we were having the discussions about the right strategy or the right approach. So it's sort of useful for understanding, when it was still in that nascent stage, what informed the approach we took. So as I say, if anyone has a little bit of time, it might be worth listening back to that as well. But I'll pop all those links in the chat.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Shemali. That's been great, and really pleased we were able to include you. Sorry you didn't get to, I don't know if you got to look at or watch the previous session that we had, or just reflect on that, or you didn't get to meet the other contributors. But again, all of these sessions that we run are available on our EDAS website, and you can access the material if you're looking to kind of build those links. Are you able to stay on for the rest of the session? I know you'll probably be busy, but there is
I will stay on for a little while, yes.
Yeah. With what you're talking about, and we're building now onto community ownership side of things. So without further ado, on that basis, can I move on to Neil now to provide the usual scene setting for this afternoon's theme of community ownership? Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Liz. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Neil McInroy. I'm the Community Wealth Advisor to the Scottish Government in the Economic Development Directorate. I do that 2 days a week. I have been since July 2020. In the Scottish Government, I sit as part of a growing team, as part of the Local Economy Delivery Unit, headed by Stephen White, and I think a few others are on the call today. The other 3 days a week, I work for the Democracy Collaborative as the Global Fellow for the Advancement of Community Wealth Building. They're based in Washington, DC, so I spend a number of those days working in the United States, albeit virtually. And also that work also includes even further afield, working in Australia and New Zealand. In fact, I had a call this morning in New Zealand, as well as other sort of parallel community wealth building activity in Europe. Now, just a bit of a backdrop. I know there's all the people coming in who may be new, and it's no bad thing just to repeat really what community wealth building is all about and how does inclusive ownership fit in. Well, community wealth building advances economic development into a new era of economic system change, tackling the causes of wealth inequality and transforming how wealth flows to secure a well-being economy for people, place and planet. Now, community wealth building is not regeneration with a new name. This is about a new culture as how we organise the economy, who owns it and who it works for. Now, inclusive ownership, the theme for today, and you'll hear from the speakers in a moment, is one of the 5 pillars of community wealth building, alongside public spending, land and property, finance and workforce. And there's been movement building, there's been practice, there's a number of pilot areas across Scotland at the moment, and there's also been policy work across Scottish Government, and also there's planned legislation for later in the parliamentary term in 2023. Now, inclusive ownership, it's arguable, but it's probably preeminently important as it goes to the heart of wealth and ownership of wealth. Now, some argue, don't they, that, well, all we need to worry about in the economy is the redistribution of wealth. Get growth, redistribute it to poorer people, welfare payments, public service and so forth. And we do need redistribution. However, in a time of fast-moving global capital, offshoring, the supremacy of shareholder dividends, there are limits to what we can traditionally do after the fact of growth and economic production. So we can redistribute through tax, welfare benefits, regeneration, but what community wealth building thinks about is pre-distribution of wealth. And look at land ownership as one example. Some of Scotland land accrues very little wealth for Scots, but a lot of wealth for others, particularly distant owners. Indeed, any return can be extracted into the ether of the global economy, and a few wealthy Scots get that return on wealth, or it goes to global investors. So community wealth building says, hold on here, let's not redistribute wealth after it's created. Let's also think about pre-distributed wealth during its creation, and ownership is key to that. So the aim of inclusive ownership is to increase the density, increase the number of enterprises in Scotland where there's community ownership, SMEs, community businesses, community land trusts, cooperatives, who are all by their very nature don't extract wealth. They don't tend to have, or don't have, distant shareholders. It's usually owned by us, Scots, in those places. So they're very much more generative. They're pre-distributive in that sense. So today we're going to explore different dimensions of pre-distributive elements in our economy. And we're going to hear from Megan McInnes from Scottish Land Commission, who will talk about land ownership. Hi, Megan. We'll hear from Dara Zaran, who will talk about employee ownership and cooperatives. Dara's from Scottish Enterprise. We heard from Mags McSporran from Highlands and Islands Enterprise talk about various aspects of community ownership. And finally, but not least, we'll hear from Morag Doig from Renfrewshire Council, who will talk about the growth of local ownership, particularly around streets within that council area. So without further ado, I think we'll go straight in. Will it come back to you, Liz, or I'll just go straight into Megan? Go straight to Megan. Megan, over to you. Some slides to share, Megan?
Thanks, Neil. And yes, I'm just trying to get these slides to work.
I'll give you a shout when they're up, Megan. We're on.
Okay, they're on.
Just do your slideshow. That's it. We're laughing.
Okay, well, it's fantastic to be part of this discussion this afternoon. So my name is Megan McInnes. I'm one of the appointed Scottish Land Commissioners, and I'm joining you from my home up here in Applecross in the North West Highlands. The Scottish Land Commission was established in 2017 by the Scottish Parliament to drive forward a programme of land reform across rural and urban areas of the country. Because land reform plays a critical role in building a well-being economy that's going to promote inclusive economic growth, reduce inequality, support climate action and a just transition, and also empower people and communities to bring about positive changes on the ground. And we see numerous connections between the land reform agenda and community wealth building. The redirection of wealth back to the local economy and placing the control and the benefits of assets and buildings in the hands of local people, the cornerstones of community wealth building. These require making substantial changes to how we think about land, how we own, use and manage it. And because of these connections, at the Land Commission, we've been collaborating with the Scottish Government, with EDAS and with a number of different local authorities involved in the pilot projects to explore how this can be done on the ground and what can be learned from it. So I'm going to focus on three things as I speak this afternoon. The first is just to make some of the high-level connections between land reform and community wealth building. The second is to speak a bit more in depth about the connections between land reform and the inclusive ownership pillar. And then the third are just to raise some ideas on the opportunities and the challenges on this moving forward. So the high-level connections between land reform and community wealth building are evident in the references to land and property across the 5 pillars of community wealth building. Just last month, the Scottish Land Commission published its guidance on community wealth building and land. And this is aimed at providing information to local authorities, these key anchor institutions in the delivery of community wealth building, in how they themselves own, manage and use land, and how they can influence others who own, manage and use land in their areas. And this has 6 recommended areas for action: supporting net zero ambitions and sustainable development, the positive management of land and assets, the productive reuse of land and buildings, collaboration and partnership, the supporting of economic growth and community aspirations, and that's where the connection most directly with the inclusive ownership pillar is, and then of course sharing information. Now, this guidance that we've published is underpinned by a key land reform policy statement of the Scottish Government, which is the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. And this statement sets the direction for Scotland's land reform agenda. This recognises that along with rights to land now come responsibilities. So as someone who owns or manages a piece of land, you now have responsibilities to think about what the impact of the way in which you manage your land, how that impacts on the local community and your neighbours, but also thinking about your responsibilities to be making sure that that piece of land can deliver for the wider public good. And so there are a number of examples of the very positive impact that community ownership of land and property can bring in rural areas, in urban areas, from the south of the country right up into the Highlands and Islands. We have a whole list of case studies on the community wealth building section of the Scottish Land Commission's website, and also on the My Land Hub. Some examples are the photos I have here on the slide. We have the West Harris Trust, the Western Isles. We have the Barnmalloch Community Development Trust in Glasgow and Belfield Church in Portobello in Edinburgh. However, because today's session is on the inclusive ownership pillar of community wealth building, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper beyond simply the acquisition of land and buildings by communities to where that's happened and it's actually delivering greater community wealth and local and social enterprises as a result of making changes to that, how those land and assets are owned. And again, there are so many examples I could have drawn on. Some are coming about as a result of changing community ownership and control. The photo at the top is a site on the south side of Glasgow called the Urban Croft. It's a joint project between South Seeds and Locavor, which transformed a derelict tennis court into an urban market garden. Locavor produces fruit and vegetables on this site, which are sold to local households, shops, businesses and restaurants. On South Seeds use the other side of the site. They've transformed it into raised beds, which local community members can come and use to grow their own produce. The photo of the timber stack on the left-hand side is on the Isle of Egg. The Isle of Egg is one of the most kind of notorious and successful examples of community ownership in Scotland. The Isle of Egg Heritage Trust, as part of their ownership of the island, they own about 250 hectares of forest land, including 70 hectares of commercial Sitka spruce. And they've just completed the process of developing a 20-year management plan for the felling of that Sitka spruce plantation that they've developed with Scottish Forestry. And they've done it in a way which not only secures long-term income for the trust and for the islanders, but also is developing a sustainable management plan for one of their key assets on the island. But from the Land Commission's perspective, the relationship between community wealth building and land reform isn't simply about transforming and changing the ownership. It's also about what can be done to deliver greater community wealth and benefits, and the generation of those benefits at the local level in terms of other changes to how we think about land, and particularly the role that local authorities as anchor institutions can play in this. So I wanted, of course, to mention the really key leadership role that North Ayrshire Council are playing on this at the moment. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the wide-ranging programme of community wealth building that they have been delivering. I wanted to in particular to mention their ambitions to transform 2 former landfill sites into a solar energy farm, because these are expected to meet at least 2/3 of the council's energy needs, as well as create from those sites financial surplus, which can then be reinvested into other community wealth building projects. At the Land Commission, we also think there's more to be explored in terms of this relationship between land reform and community wealth building, in terms of some more innovative models of ownership and governance of land and buildings. The Scottish Government has already set a target to increase diversity in land ownership, and what they mean here is making it easier for more people to get involved in the ownership, management and use of land in their areas. And we're shortly going to be publishing some research which outlines the social and the economic benefits that can come by increasing that diversity of land ownership. We also, however, see a lot of potential in using more innovative governance models around land and buildings here in Scotland. We tend to have quite a siloed approach to this, thinking about land ownership being either by the public sector or private sector or NGOs or by communities, whereas across Europe it's much more common for a single piece of land to be co-owned by a combination of these actors, and in a very successful way. And there's a lot, we think, that can be learnt here in Scotland from that model. And this is actually already being explored here. The National Trust, which has owned the Isles of Canna and Sanday since the early 1980s, last year launched the Canna Partnership, which is a mechanism through which islanders are going to be able to get much more involved in the formal operation and strategic management of the islands. So you asked me also to think about some key challenges from the Scottish Land Commission's perspective, and one of the key challenges to everything that we're trying to do at the moment in terms of land reform are the significant changes we've seen in the land markets and land values, particularly in rural areas, in the last 18 months as a result of the increasing demand for land for natural capital projects, for forestry projects, and from non-farm lifestyle purchases. We've just published a significant market analysis of this situation, because we're very concerned about a number of the implications, not just for community groups who are trying to raise funds to buy land in their areas, but also around what the implications are for the transparency around these transactions, as well as how we make sure that the benefits are fairly shared, which accrue from this project. Another challenge is that as we heard from Jamila, and I'm sure we'll hear from the other speakers, local authorities play an incredibly important anchor institutional role in the delivery and the use of community wealth building as an approach to everything that they are doing. But these same local authorities are facing significant resource cuts and significant pressure. So we really hope that the work that we are doing, for example, the guidance we publish for local authorities, can help those local authorities who are not yet part of the pilot project be inspired to consider a community wealth building approach, and to see just what the amazing things that can be delivered from this approach, and the different examples from across Scotland are on the ground. Because it's clear that the community wealth building approach is being supported, and there are a number of opportunities around a wide range of policy commitments and frameworks to help deliver this on the ground. And as Neil has already mentioned, we have the opportunity in the current Parliament to bring this all together within the legislation with the Community Wealth Building Bill and also a Land Reform Bill, which are both coming forward in 2023. So it's a really exciting time to be involved in land reform and community wealth building, and I'm really excited to hear for the rest of the session this afternoon. So thanks, Neil. I'm going to hand back to you now.
And I'll hand straight on to Liz. Thanks, Megan. That was fantastic. Liz.
Yes, thanks, Megan. That was a really good overview. I'm just looking again. There's some comments in the chat box, but not so much questions. But just one quick point I was wanting to ask you there, Megan. What's been the response to the guidance that was recently produced on community wealth building and land? I mean, that's all fairly recent, isn't it? Can you get a sense just of how that's being received and how it's being starting to be utilised?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the guidance was launched by Minister Tom Arthur at the end, the culmination of our Land Reuse Month campaign, which ran through the whole of March. So it has literally been just a couple of weeks, but the guidance itself was developed through a strong stakeholder engagement and an advisory group made up of a number of different stakeholders and anchor organisations who are delivering community wealth building on the ground. So we very much hope that it was embedded in real practice, and it's going to be taken forward. It's being delivered as part of our good practice programme. So it's one of a number of different toolkits and materials and protocols which can help anyone who's responsible for owning and managing land think about delivering more responsible land ownership on the ground, and also thinking about embedding community wealth building within what they're doing.
Thanks, Megan. I'm giving a bit of a plug to that. I was involved in shaping some of that. So, but just for the audience, if people haven't picked up on that, we can share that. I'm just going to sort of speaking to the team here, but I'm assuming that we can share a link to that as well as part of our kind of connecting things up role within this series of events. Okay, I'm not seeing any other kind of questions coming through on the chat just yet, so we're going to move on, I think, just in the interest of time. Yeah, we're just keeping to time here. Can I now move on and welcome Dara Zaran, who's Social Economy Manager with Scottish Enterprise, and she's going to speak to us today about employee ownership from a community wealth building perspective. And I know that Dara has a wealth of experience kind of in this area and in the social economy more generally. So Dara, I'm really looking forward to what you're going to share on this with us today.
Great, thank you very much. Earlier I fell at the first hurdle trying to share my slides, so fingers crossed that I'm actually going to manage it this time. So please do let me know if it comes up. How are we doing? Is that up yet?
Yes, can see that fine.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so I know there are some people I know on this call. So speaking to friends and hopefully new friends, I am the manager of the Inclusive Models team in Scottish Enterprise, within which is the Cooperative Development Scotland Service, and it is responsible for driving up the number of cooperative models, primarily through its support of community co-ops, consortia co-ops, and employee ownership, which is thankfully becoming a very popular model, and we're getting a lot of inquiries and a lot of interest in what employee ownership can do for individual business leaders, for workforces, and also for local communities. So I'm hoping that today will be a relatively positive and reassuring overview of what we've got in Scotland in this area. Cooperative Development Scotland has been going for a long time. We have matured our service over the years, about 15 years, and we have a network of expert advisors to support business leaders to introduce employee ownership. What I would say the real difference is now is the appetite, and it's supported by, a number of policies. But I seem to be missing a slide, which is a bit unfortunate. But a number of policies have really been triggered by Scotland's ambition to be a well-being government and a well-being economy. And in 2019, Nicola Sturgeon, during her TED talk, talked about why Scotland had to play its part and making an economy that was really about enhancing people's well-being, and why we should prioritise well-being. And it's not just a political moral imperative, she said, but it was a momentous opportunity. And so I think this is a huge ambition to set out for us. And obviously what it's done is bring, really positive policies like community wealth building. But it is something that I think requires a lot of work to turn that ambition into results. And even though the seeds were planted a long time ago in key areas like the development of Cooperative Development Scotland, I think we can really bring that strong experience around inclusive models and what is essentially a tried and tested infrastructure that we've got in our ecosystem to really scale that up to ensure that the pillars of our mainstream economy, the models that we have that I think until relatively recently were considered the rank outsiders, the social enterprises, the employee-owned businesses, the co-ops, we have an opportunity now and a challenge to really bring those into the mainstream and to give the validation and recognition that these very innovative and very visionary and I think very honourable business leaders deserve. So there are a number of reasons why we know employee ownership actually makes sense, because emerging from this vision of a well-being government is now hard targets. We have an aspiration now in Scotland and a manifesto commitment actually to increase the number of employee-owned businesses that we have to 500. So we're currently sitting at around 170, and by 2030 there is now a wealth of support and a wealth of ambition that says we can do this, we can scale this up to 500, and it's based on a number of complementary policy principles and directives like fairer work, and obviously the community wealth building and the requirements for inclusive ownership. But it's also in recognition that employee ownership is a very strong model for economic success. So we know that these business models consistently outperform their non-EO counterparts in these areas, and we have found that while this is increasingly an important option for succession planning, and certainly the pandemic and COVID has had a lot of people thinking about what they want to do in the future and how they want to actually start to manage succession within their businesses. This is really, a key area of development for us, and it's been really valuable because it's allowed us to build up a critical mass. It's allowed us to actually conduct surveys like this that show that inclusive ownership works, that this model is a very sound local and national contributor to our economy. And it's also allowed us to showcase the relevance of this model across a range of diverse industry sectors and geographies and size of company. It doesn't really matter when we're looking at the benefits, and it is effectively a tool in our toolkit that lends itself to that transformational well-being economic development and that more equally distributed wealth. And it's got sort of non-negotiable benefits, like it roots businesses in the community. And critically, when you're talking about actually developing a structure, a legal structure, it no longer depends on just one enlightened owner doing the right thing by their workforce or doing the right thing by their local community, but it embeds those inclusive, those fair work, democratic principles into the DNA of the organisation. So that's what really makes it a very valuable mainstay when we're looking at sort of creative economics moving forward. So as I said, Cooperative Development Scotland, it sits within Scottish Enterprise. We work closely with Highlands and Islands Enterprise and South of Scotland, and it is the arm of these enterprise agencies that supports company growth through that collaborative, sort of democratically owned model. And I think these models are definitely coming into their own. we've got, policy, practice, experience, and ambition that sort of creates that perfect storm for that genuine economic transformation. And that's really what we're talking about. What are our options? What's the potential for us to create that fairer and happier and healthier Scotland? And I know that, Neil was talking about it isn't just about wealth distribution. That's absolutely right. But there's no doubt that this is a very good foundation, that, the wealth is created and it is distributed more equally by working within that employee ownership model. So, we have an approach that requires a really collaborative partnership, understanding and agreement that this is something that should be pan-Scotland. This is something that should be in every community, or an option for every business leader. And even though at the minute, I think employee-owned businesses are considered niche models, they are definitely not peripheral to our economic ambitions. If we really do want that well-being economy that we talk about, that that manages our wealth creation fairly, and this is an absolutely critical solution if we want to keep those businesses that are created in Scotland retained in Scotland. So increasingly, as I say, the potential and the value and the performance of these employee-owned businesses has been recognised, and now I think we need to scale up, and we need to use these techniques and these partnerships and these stakeholder alliances to get that stronger, that larger, that instantly recognisable community of democratic business models, which is both world leading, showing that Scotland actually creates a culture of economic health as well as economic wealth, but also that acts as an inspiration for other business leaders who are very keen to know how they can play into this piece and how they can use their businesses in a way that actually contributes to their own local communities and to their own very practical bonuses like staff retention, staff retainment, staff investment, and staff talent. So, as we come out of the pandemic, we are seeing a significant change and a significant movement. And as I mentioned earlier, we have about 170 employee-owned businesses operating in Scotland. But, it's a significant change, I think, in pace and also in interest. And what we're finding, so that an EOT, an employee-owned trust, is gaining a lot more interest. We're seeing significant increases, and we're seeing a lot of business leaders coming along, finding out about what their options are and opting to share a lot of their ownership with their employees. So you can see the statistics in front of us, and as I said, 500 employee-owned businesses by 2030 seemed like really quite a steep target, and while it's challenging, it does feel as if it's getting more and more achievable, because this is something that, as I said, has business sense, community sense, place-based support for it, and increasingly business leaders are seeing that it is not detrimental to the success of their business, rather the opposite. So we've had a few very nice examples. I don't think we've got the Okrani up there, but Okrani is a great example of employee ownership that has been very successful for the outgoing owners, for the local community, for the workforce. It's, for those of you who don't know, it's a luxury hotel and resort on the Isle of Arran, and it's of huge importance to the local community in terms of maintaining facilities, inviting tourism, retaining jobs, and really as a local economy asset. And this was a family business until 2018, and the owners, when they were looking at their options, they really wanted to protect their 160 staff, the existing team, and create future jobs. They wanted to protect the legacy of the resort they'd built up, the community facilities, and critically, actually, the ethos of their company. And this is, despite all of the economic earthquakes, I think, that have been caused by COVID so far, the Okrani is still a really important asset and a great example of employee ownership for a local island community. There's also, you can see there, Chemco, which is, another example of a employee ownership working in a different sector. So an engineering company in Coatbridge, 100% of the ownership was transferred into an employee ownership trust, which effectively meant that the employees who are the beneficiaries of that trust become the major shareholder in the business. So immediately there is an investment there, and the employee voice and the employee creativity is put to sort of maximum impact. And again, it was about retaining the company in the local community, protecting jobs, skills, wanting continuity both for employees and for customers. So again, you know, allowing the employees who had had a major role in building up the business, keeping them supporting and having a say in the future of the business and maintaining that social ethos. And then just lastly, you know, Aquascot there, that's another example in Easter Ross, a key supplier to Waitrose, influenced by the John Lewis employee ownership model. And really, again, you know, a very, very successful transition and retaining that idea of inclusive ownership in the supply chain. And so all of these logos in front of you have been business owners who have really wanted to protect, support, retain, and ensure that communities are not badly impacted by their desire to move on or their need to move on. And it's allowing us to tell very compelling stories of how inclusive ownership, democratic ownership benefits everyone, how it's a win-win for everybody if entered into with the right support, the right advice, and you know, the blessing and the investment and the engagement of staff. So, you know, when we're looking at how do we actually make the most of all of these very favourable elements in our business community at the minute, that strong policy incentive, that interest from business leaders, the requirement to actually take what was a niche service and make it much more central to our thinking, to our understanding, to our planning for our business outputs and our economic aspirations. And this is really how we think we need to do it with all of our partners and all of our stakeholders, and make it much more of a collaborative approach. And it is actually about saying there's lots of ways that we can do this that actually allows people to be less not intimidated, but maybe less wary of what inclusive ownership means. And it's not about reducing the wealth that we create, it's about using that wealth to create economic health. So how do we educate people? How do we ensure that things are done differently in a way that aligns with our fairer, greener, healthier, happier Scottish aspirations? And what we're doing at the minute now is we're responding to the need to build a market of employee-owned businesses due to a number of the factors. And this is where the opportunities are and the challenges. They do tend to sit side by side, but I think what's driving it is genuine interest in doing something new, genuine response to and demand from business leaders that has been triggered, you know, I think probably recently by the pandemic. It has made people think differently about how they want to move things forward. So we're looking at that demand. We're looking at policies that have democratic practices at the heart of their aspirations. So obviously community wealth building is one of the biggest drivers for this. But there is, you know, this model lends itself to fair work. It lends itself to place-based wealth creation and distribution. And it's about raising awareness that there are other ways to do business. And I think while we said that succession is you know, a really big market driver for this, I think there's real opportunity for us to start embedding this through an educational program into our future entrepreneurs, into our education system, and actually just work to understand that startup inclusive ownership can be introduced at any stage of the business development process. So we're looking at, you know, how do we do this in a way that actually builds upon the very strong infrastructures we have, the very strong aspirations and awareness that we already have, and how do we scale up what is already actually quite a mature and sophisticated ecosystem to get maximum impact from this moment and this window that I think we have open to us. And it, you know, the solution is part of a much bigger picture to really get this embedded in our approach and our policies and our behaviours and our priorities. So inclusive models like co-ops, social enterprises, but the driver at the minute, the employee ownership, it's no longer thought of as marginal or a solution that's on the margins of mainstream business practice. We need to all work together. We need to look at local, national, regional, sectoral solutions to make sure that this is recognized as a sophisticated and an understood mainstay of our economic value system, and its reach needs to be much more widespread, and that has to be a team approach that has to reach all of the corners of Scotland. And I think at the minute we have an element of surprise that such a model exists and that is successful and that is high in productivity and strong retention and retainment and really strong resilience. We know from research that we did during COVID that these are very resilient models and that they have financial resilience and social resilience. But we need that element of surprise to dissipate. And, our acceptance of the model, I think, needs to be replaced by expectation. And I suppose that, if we start to be complacent that models that are driving fair and inclusive and equal impact, if they're no longer worthy of comment and we become complacent about it, I hope that's because we wake up and they are actually mainstream and that people are no longer wary about the idea of inclusive ownership and actually proactively pursue it. So I think for this, we need that team approach. We need a common understanding and a collective will to understand what these models do. And we need to have the infrastructure and the ecosystem where every member of it supports alternative democratic models. And I think that these sessions are the start to creating that very hospitable environment where investment in such a model is readily available, the policies and the regulations that sort of incentivize these models are there, and it's not just that we are promoting the business benefits to the owner, but that idea that economic health comes from inclusive ownership just becomes part of our narrative. So I think I'll just stop presenting there.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was really interesting, really reflective, and quite detailed, but also kind of just gave us a real sense diving into some of the detail and the planning and the thinking that's going into this. I think it's fascinating what you were saying about the shift that perhaps has taken place as a result of the pandemic. We're seeing that in a lot of different areas of the work that we're doing. I am wondering if perhaps EDAS can come on board, if we're not already recognised as either a national partner or a policy stakeholder or something as part of this, to try and take forward more of what you're doing here today. So that was really fascinating. I can see there's a question in the chat box from Alison Owens. If you could maybe just quickly answer this one for us, Dara. What's the biggest role that anchor institutions in Scotland can play in increasing the number or size of employee-owned businesses in Scotland?
So I think that's at the crux actually of how we move this forward. And that was a relatively detailed presentation because actually we've been, I think, talking around the fringes of this for quite a long time, and it is time to get into the detail. And I think what we need to do is get our anchor institutions to start proactively encouraging partnerships and collaborations and business to business associations with recognisable inclusive ownership models. Because I think at the minute we're leaving it up to all sorts of factors, and it is a nice to do thing rather than a necessary to do thing. So I think one of the big jobs ahead of us is that awareness raising and making sure that people actually understand why these models are different and why these models can bring more than just monetary value to anchor institutions and to business partnerships and commercial partnerships. And I think that's really what we need to do. We're focusing on trying to get business leaders to adopt these models. What we then need to do is start working with anchor organisations and stakeholders to use these models in a really impactful way in their own business dealings. Otherwise, we are missing each other in terms of really getting that traction between policy and practice and business supply and business demand. So I don't know if that's answered the question, but for me, it's actually now about nailing down the detail of working together and taking principle into practice.
Yeah, and I think so much of what you've described, as you say, it's just central to what we're trying to achieve here around, creating a fairer, more equitable economy, going forward. And this is a mechanism to do that. So you're right. I suppose my question at the beginning when you started to speak was, when you described about the bringing all of this activity, social enterprises, co-ops, etc., into the mainstream. That is just the challenge. You're right, because it's so often has just been thought of as something that sits over here on the side, a bit like broader third sector activity, I suppose, as well. So how do we work collectively? How do we gain and garner the collective input in order to really make a difference?
Can I just say, I mean, I think just to the second part of that answer would be that we need to redefine value in economic terms. Value isn't just value for money. Value is that economic health as well as economic wealth. It's, what are we paying for? And we're not just paying for, return on investment in monetary terms. We're paying for, contracts that actually make sure the people at the heart of them are well looked after, that the social impact is as great as the financial impact, and the environmental impact. And so when people are looking for value for their money, redefining what that value is in social capital and human capital as well as financial capital is just as important. And we need to do that across all our local authorities and all of our anchor organisations.
Absolutely. Although I'm interested as well what you were saying about profitability and productivity and employee engagement and business resilience, all of those things together that actually, we're kind of outperforming other models. I mean, again, I bet a lot of people don't perhaps appreciate that. So that's perhaps around the, the work that you're doing about raising awareness and building that visibility of what this model has to offer. So anyway, really fascinating. Thanks very much, Dara. I think we're going to move on now, just mindful of time. We're moving on now to hear from, to be linked, I'm sure, but Mags McSporran, who's Head of Social Enterprise Development with Highlands and Islands Enterprise. And Mags is going to share some examples from this region, which of course we know is a region with a rich tradition of community ownership, engagement, empowerment. So long tradition there, Mags. So really looking forward to what you're going to share with us this afternoon. Over to you, and I can see you've got slides as well.
Thank you. Just one or two. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, folks. I'm Mags McSporran. I'm Head of Social Enterprise Development for Highlands and Islands Enterprise. I'll give you a little bit of what we are or what we are and do. And over the next 10 minutes, give you some insight into the current state of play around about inclusive ownership in the Highlands and Islands, some of the challenges and opportunities, and where we're headed. As you say, there's a lot of crossover here in the space that we've been working in. So Highlands and Islands Enterprise, we work in a very diverse region. We're one of 3 enterprise agencies for Scotland. We and SOCI have both an economic and community development remit. So we work in a slightly different way than that of Scottish Enterprise. But as Dara's already said, we work as a threesome very, very often. And we all deliver national programmes at varying points in time. So it's always worth not only having a look at what's being delivered within your geography, but also nationally across the patch. So our diverse region extends from Shetland to Argyll and from the Outer Hebrides to Moray. We cover more than half of Scotland's landmass, and we have teams, about 8 teams, based on sub-regional basis, so based on an area basis, helping communities and businesses to develop and grow. We basically help people to build a stronger economy and a better future. What are our priorities in that? Well, building successful, productive and resilient businesses, enabling strong, capable and resourceful communities, and creating the conditions for growth and a green recovery. Next slide, please, Alison. So in doing that, we work with businesses, communities and social enterprises. On to 4, please, Alison. In terms of inclusive ownership, what's the current state of play? So in 2019, we had 1,270 social enterprises recorded in the region. Of those social enterprises, we had companies limited by guarantee unincorporated entities, difficult for me to say, CICs, SCIOs, trusts and registered societies. And interestingly, in a recent survey of regional businesses among employers in the region, 40% considered their business to be employee owned, while 58% did not. And in that survey, employee ownership wasn't defined. But what's really interesting is the attitude that's coming through there, that groundswell that Darius referred to earlier. So in the area, we currently work more closely with around 150 socially based entities of varying legal forms. 41% of the 1,270 recorded in 2019 are social enterprises covering a neighbourhood and community and are led by and accountable to people in the area. This type of organisation is a significant proportion of the entities that we currently work with and work closely with, as by their nature, they recirculate wealth back into the place they're located in. Dara's already mentioned the employee ownership entities that we have in the likes of Aquascot and Ochrani on Arran, and in terms of social enterprises. In terms of employee ownership enterprises. However, in terms of social enterprises, we have the likes of the Loch Ness Hub providing employment in its community. And in terms of land ownership, I should mention that I'm talking to you from my home on the island of Gia, which is a community-owned trust, community land-owning trust. On Gia, and the example that I was going to use today was the West Harris Trust. So we can skip that slide, thankfully. So across the following slides, I'll try to give you some insight into some of these various forms of enterprise entities that we work with, but I'll skip employee ownership and keep the land ones to a minimum. So if we could go on to slide 5, please, Alison. So one of the forms of community development organisation, so inclusive ownership entity, is a community development entity. And this slide shows us the view which you'll see on PAPI Development Trust's website. Within these slides, embedded within these slides, are links to our case studies that are available through the HI website. So when you get the pack, if you've got a cup of coffee and 5 or 10 minutes to spare, a wee cruise through will give you stronger insight into what's actually being achieved by these entities. So PAPI Development Trust was established in 2013, and they pulled together a comprehensive development plan for the community, focusing on key community priorities. So those community priorities are helping. So the community have a population of around 80 to 90 people who are islanders making a living through farming, fishing, building trades, and increasingly through tourism and the creative industries and distance working. The community, their skills and efforts combined, are rejuvenating PAPI and have brought back into use several long abandoned homes and brought back to life the community for locals and incomers alike. At the moment, the Trust employs 2 people directly, but they have in their sites growing employment, influencing and growing transport links, creating opportunities for young people and increasing access to affordable housing. These are all declared community priorities that the Trust is working with, the development company is working with the community to grow. So basically, they are creating the conditions for economic and social activity to grow in their island area. So that's a community development trust. In terms of community energy, next one please, Alison. Sorvis is company limited by guarantee, and its objectives are to strengthen and support the communities of Glenurquhart and Strathglass through revenues from local energy schemes. So basically the entity has been established and to support that area, that specific area. Through a process of research and community engagement, they've identified 4 broad objectives for focus and for investing the funds that they draw in from energy generation. Those are eradication of fuel poverty, protecting the unique environment, economic community growth, and increasing the quality of life for residents. So they have, as an entity, they've acquired 1 virtual wind turbine, and between the income generated from that turbine and what's drawn in from other community benefit schemes around and about the area, they invest in those 4 key priorities in the region. Next slide, please, Alison. This is Antala in Harris, in West Harris, and what land ownership there has opened the door for is for the community to identify its priorities and stimulate population growth. So since 2010, they've achieved projects in energy generation, they've created new housing, they've brought in business opportunities into the area and created community facilities. So basically what they've done is grown the population of the area and grown the economic and cultural prosperity of the area. Moving on to South Harris, next slide please, Alison, is now my computer may have hung, but well, maybe I'll just keep going. Yep. So in South Harris, another form of a inclusive model is community cooperatives, and this is a long-standing favourite of mine. In the area of South Harris, shouldn't have favourites. In the area of South Harris, the community were finding that they were going to be without a shop. So they worked to set up the community cooperative. Now, over the intervening years, so that was set up in 1979, and it was just genuinely a village shop where you could get your groceries. It was a fraction of the size of the building that you see here. In the intervening period, what Inclachan's grown to is a grocery store, a full-scale grocery store, but also a craft shop and exhibition area for the many visitors that come to the area. So what it is effectively is a destination, a tourism destination in itself, and that has had the multiplier effect in the local community as well. So it's a brilliant resource in South Harris. Well, next slide please, Alison. Next one's a social enterprise, and again it's one of the things that consistently seems to be a recurring theme with entities of these forms is that the approach to the development, the establishment, is born out of a crisis of some form in a community. And the Loch Ness Hub was a case where the Visitor Information Centre was closing down. Local community came together and said, this is not ideal for the community. We see an opportunity to revitalise the building and develop new and expanding services, and to expand services that could benefit local residents and visitors. So they moved to buy the hub and have set up, as you can see, it serves as a community transport hub, a vehicle charging point, e-bike hire, local heritage, motorhome service point, tours and tickets. So not only is it providing services for the local community and investment for the local community, it's providing a strong support for the tourism sector in that area. So next slide, please, Alison. Thank you. Inclusive ownership challenges. These 3 look very, very similar, and Chris Cook I think you were there ahead of me. So first off, what are the challenges in terms of forms of inclusive ownership, in terms of for the entrepreneurs trying to move forward with establishing and growing inclusive forms of ownership? Those challenges tend to be the recurring ones that come up. The first two are recurring ones that come up, fed back to us from the entities themselves. And these are capacity in terms of time, and at times skills, because in some areas the diversity of skills is more limited. The digital age is changing that, thankfully. So it provides the opportunity for skills to be spread far more balanced way. Access to finance. There are finance mechanisms, there are innovative finance mechanisms coming about in this sector, being grown in this sector, forms of patient capital that work with the way that income is generated and the way that money is redistributed back into the entity or back into the place. But these forms of finance are not necessarily easy to find, and for someone operating a business, it can be a challenge to put together the packages of information required and run the business. Last one is preconceptions of social enterprise, and this is one of more and more, especially in the procurement arena, there needing to maybe be a wee change in how social enterprise is regarded, and more of a recognition of the professionalism and expertise that is present in our social enterprise, aka inclusive ownership models, business space. With each of the examples, the consistent theme is, as you would expect, the wealth recirculating into place to benefit the local economy and community and well-being. Where we are headed, next slide please, Alison, and I promise I'm going to stop in just a second, is basically more please in all of our twist terms. We welcome socially based businesses of all forms in the region. We see them as extremely valuable to the growth of place. Where do we see some opportunities, some key opportunities? Around about succession organisations, around about the growth of resilience in supply chains, especially in tourism, food and drink, and some emerging sectors, won't mention space, and public sector procurement are the kind of three key areas where we see particular opportunities in the years ahead. But that does not mean that asset ownership does not provide a very, very strong opportunity in our region, and will continue to do so. Absolutely. Thank you very much, folks.
Thanks so much, Mags. That was a lot of information to cover, but I think, again, it was really worthwhile looking at all of those types of entities and models, and giving us a sense of, again, just the kind of geographic spread as well across a very wide region, and the value of those models in different contexts. I'm just looking to see, I'm not seeing questions coming up, more sort of comments that are coming into the chat box. So because of timing, I'm not going to. I'm just wanting to move on, I think, because I'm conscious that we're slightly over, and I do want to have time for Morag as well, who's our next speaker, and perhaps we can wrap up if there's time at the end with any kind of concluding questions and remarks. So can I just finally then move on and welcome Morag Doig, who works for economic development within Renfrewshire Council, and she's going to share details of a thing called Startup Street Partnership Model, which has been developed for local entrepreneurs and startup businesses across in a particular areas of Renfrewshire. So Morag, do we have you here? I'm not seeing you on my screen yet. There we go. Great. Thank you, Morag.
Hi,
and you've got
everyone.
slides as well.
Yeah, lovely. Hi everyone, so I'm the lead on community wealth building for Renfrewshire Council. I also work within our management teams to look at new projects and the performance of our existing economic development programmes within Renfrewshire, with a particular focus on community wealth building approach. So Startup Street, as you can see, is a destination that we've created for each of our town centres for entrepreneurial activity. We want to proactively grow our private and third sectors, and we want to increase the visibility of our project. So this is our first centre, which opened in November 2020, right in the start of the second lockdown, believe it or not, in Paisley Town Centre. The idea behind Startup Street is to look at a new business model for subsidised and shared accommodation. For Startup Street, the economic development team take rundown and unused retailer office units in the heart of our town centres, and we transform them into business incubator hubs, offering a 2-year rent reducing subsidy for small businesses to grow and develop. So this is a collective of our first cohort of small businesses. The aim of Startup Street is to create an entrepreneurial ecosystem within Renfrewshire, which will support the creation and growth of new and diverse businesses within the area. So we've got many different types of businesses that have been attracted to the project, particularly during COVID, when we find many people are now reevaluating their work and their sectors. So these are a couple of our businesses that are tenants within our Paisley project. So businesses at Startup Street can rent their first commercial space for up to 2 years, with lease costs incrementally increased until they are ready to move on to an alternative commercial space within Renfrewshire. The reason that we give them grant subsidy for the rental income is to ensure that they have a period of time to grow and develop their financial capabilities and their sustainability in their business model before they go on to taking on their first commercial space within another premises within Renfrewshire. So it's about long-term sustainability and support. The costs in the workspaces that we cover are Wi-Fi, utility bills, they get access to meeting rooms, one-to-one guidance, mentoring from established businesses through our community benefits programme, workshops, masterclasses, and crucially, they get support from our enterprise manager, which is based in each of our locations, and also access to support from our business gateway team within the council. And we feel that creating a community of support within the businesses is really crucial. Startup Street rationale behind the project. So we surveyed local business startups going back to 2018 to ask them what they felt the area needed to help them grow. The survey found that more than 80% of the businesses locally were looking for subsidised space to grow. So they said that the barriers for them growing to the next stage of their business was the high cost of rent, and also crucially the lack of know-how and confidence in taking those next steps. So most people were still operating their businesses to a very small scale and also from their homes, essentially. So Startup Street is part of our wider economic development package for local businesses. So this includes our incubator programme. We also have a creative hubs model, which is slightly different to Startup Street in that we have an anchor business that takes on the rent for a unit within the town centre. We give them a grant subsidy over a period of time for their rent on the condition that they take in smaller creative businesses in the same creative sector as themselves, and they help to mentor and grow those other businesses. We also have the Incube shop, which is based in Paisley Town Centre, which is a dual purpose. The shop helps to train and support local unemployed people to move into customer service and into retail. But it also then allows a trading place or a physical trading spot for some of the products from our Creative Hub models in our incubator programme. So it's a really ethical shopping experience, and we find that a lot of customers and a lot of the community within Renfrewshire really support the idea of helping someone to gain skills and qualifications at the same time as buying something that has been designed and made and produced locally. We also have our business gateway service and our enterprise and employability services within the council. Startup Street model itself requires us to take on vacant council premises, so premises that have been vacant for more than 5 years and in a state of dilapidation. So they've been put on the market, there's absolutely no interest in them, and they're sitting vacant and they're going unused. The refurbishment of the project is using town centre regeneration funds and also our own economic development budget. Each of the models, of which we have 3 currently, have a third sector partner who manage the facility, which helps us to keep the resources local and also helps us to build the capacity within the third sector. We feel that it's really important that we use third sector, social enterprises and charities because they're closest to the community, and they also have access to understanding the resources that are required to support the community. The focus for us is on long-term economic benefits for Renfrewshire, so it's really about that ecosystem that we're talking about. It's about growing those private sectors long-term and those third sectors. There's no financial gain for the council at all in the short or long term, so it's all investment in terms of the public sector. Each of our centres are themed to support areas which show growth within Renfrewshire. So youth enterprise is the theme for our Paisley Centre. We have a female-led enterprise centre which is opening in Renfrew in August this year, and we have a community-led focused business in Johnston, which is a slightly different model to the council premises one. This gives you an idea of our Johnston project, as I mentioned, is slightly different. So within our model, we have some flexibility. They don't necessarily need to be council-owned properties that are vacant. In Johnston, we were approached by Active Communities, which is a charity within Johnston who wanted to create a community hub based in the old Johnston Police Station. So they got a community asset transfer and they now call it Station 7, which is due to open this month. They had vacant units at the back of the premises which they didn't know what to do with, and they approached ourselves as a council and asked us how they could repurpose them for the benefit of the community. So we thought it'd be a great idea to put community wellbeing businesses within a Startup Street project within the community hub in Johnston. So the community Startup Street in Johnston, the facilities will focus on health and wellbeing businesses and form part of the new Station 7 premises, with businesses able to work with community groups and people using the facilities. So this is more holistic and wellbeing therapies that fit with the physical, emotional, social support that Active Communities provide through Station 7 to the community. So it's a slightly different twist on what we do in Renfrew and in Paisley, but again fits within that ethos of growing different community, third sector and private sector organisations. So Startup Street currently has 3 models. We have Startup Street Paisley, which is our youth enterprise centre. That's been open since November 2020 and supports over 36 businesses currently. Some of them are tenants in our managed workspaces and some of them are pre-start activity businesses. Our Johnston premises is opening this month, and already we have a list of businesses wanting to move in. And we have Startup Street Renfrew, which is our female-led accelerator and female-led business centre in Renfrew, which is due to open in August this year. We look for opportunities constantly within our work within the council to see if we can find other premises within town centres and villages across the area to grow the private and third sector. But I think importantly for us, we don't see any legislation or policy as a barrier to good practice for community wealth building. It's really essential for us to work in collaboration with other council services and with the community and with private sector, and engage with them directly to share our knowledge and expertise and our resources and our funding. And as mentioned before, this is a model that has no financial gain for the council, but is really, really crucial for us in terms of the long-term support that we can provide in terms of regeneration and economic activity within Renfrewshire as an area. So I'll stop sharing just now, and I'll just put it open to ask if anybody has any questions in relation to our project.
Thanks so much. That's really excellent. Thank you for that contribution, Morag. I can see there's one question, and before we move to the question that's specific in the chat box, can I just? It sounds as though from what you're describing, there's been a real kind of shift in terms of the focus on partnership working, collaboration. I'm not saying that didn't happen in the past, but there's perhaps been a shift to really put a focus on that now moving forward with the council, and that you were emphasising a lot third sector there. Can you say a bit more about perhaps where that's come from, or just what's driven that?
Yeah, essentially we've been thinking for a few years now in terms of how we can engage more internally and externally with our stakeholders, but trying to move away from traditional routes. So often we'll go to well-established routes like the Chamber, where businesses are already registered, or where we have a third sector partner who's well-established in the community. And we've opened that up and really asked people through various engagement forums and surveys, what do you think the community needs to do with these spaces, and what do you think we can do to support that? So I think really it's essentially a question for ourselves as a large anchor organisation. We know what we know, but there's a lot that we don't know. and we want to be approachable, and we want to put that out there. So this is really driven, this model, by the small SMEs and the community third sector partners that have said we don't have enough spaces out there that are subsidised and affordable. But also when you're in those spaces, to become sustainable, you need that wraparound support. You need that period of time to adjust and to learn how to grow your business in a stable financial way. We also have the resource, not only a business gateway, but we have our communities funding team who can go in and help them. So if somebody wants to be employee owned, or if they want to be a social enterprise or a community interest business, they can help them attract funding, they can help them attract support, they can give them the right advice as to how to become those models. So I think that's really important, because people have ambition, they just don't always have the confidence or the capacity to take the next step. So we're hoping that what we can then do as a partner is just come in when required for the part that we're required to do. This is not really branded as a council project. It's really driven in each location by our partners. We didn't want it to be seen as an anchor organisation project or a council driven project or a public sector project. This is really about what the private sector needs to grow and what the third sector needs from us to grow as well. So that's essentially where we sit with it at the moment.
Okay, and you've given sort of examples of 3 areas there. I mean, are there plans clearly, presumably, to expand then across the totality of the Renfrewshire Council region?
Yes, well, essentially we started off looking at 1, and as soon as it went to board, we ended up with 3. So it's very popular with our councillors. It's got a lot of buy-in at senior level in the council. Each of our councillors want to have those in our area. They see demand, they see need, they see the pressure of people who have lost their jobs and who now are working from their home and really feeling that they need to grow those businesses instead of those businesses coming under strain and then eventually disappearing. And also diversification. I think COVID has taught us that we can't rely on traditional means, and we need a strong local supply chain within Renfrewshire, and the only way that we'll get that is by growing that and supporting that from the roots up ourselves.
Okay, and that perhaps links to, there's a question in the box from Margaret, from Mags, about asking how you assess and identify the community needs to inform the themes of the street, or your model.
Yeah, we did a bit of research around about where Renfrewshire was placed against Scotland and the rest of Europe, essentially, when it came to female-led enterprise and youth enterprise. They were areas in particular we hadn't a great deal of focus on in Renfrewshire. We pretty much had an open door. We'll work with any business who has a requirement. But what we realised actually is there's certain particular needs within that we need to focus in on. We also went out to schools, went out to community groups, we went to networking events and asked people, essentially put the door open and ask the question, who are you, what do you need, and how can we facilitate it? And I think being really open to those responses has really educated us as to what our community needs. It's very easy as a large bureaucratic organisation to make assumptions, and they can often be wrong about, we can look at a paper and say this tells us we need this economic project, but that's not necessarily what's really needed on the ground. So yeah, we had to do a bit of research, but we also had to open that question up to those groups directly.
Okay. That's been really, I think, a really fantastic, varied collection of contributions this afternoon. So thanks for that, Morag. Thanks to everybody who's given up their time and shared their knowledge and their expertise at this afternoon's session. Jamila, Neil, obviously, as our regular supporter and driver of all of this, Megan, Dara, Mags and Morag, really do appreciate you taking the time here. What I think you can see in the chat box, Elaine from EDAS has obviously just reminded you that all of the information here will be shared. We'll include links, we'll include slides, the presentations that we've had, and also that our next session is taking place on the 17th of May, and the focus of that is going to be on local authorities. So again, just ask everybody to make sure you sign up for that if that's an area that you're interested in, and if you're following through on the totality of all of our sessions here. There's also going to be a kind of an extra session that's come up now on the 19th of May. It's actually we're going to test out an in-person event, see what the appetite for that is now that we're hopefully moving back to some kind of normality. And we're going to be welcoming a really special and prestigious guest from the United States, Ted Howard, who is really kind of the originator for community wealth building in the United States. And also we're going to have the Minister Tom Arthur with us. There's a link in the chat box about that, but we'll obviously be publicising that over the next few weeks as well. So please do look to come along to that, and we'll decide on the format and nearer the time in terms of whether we have a mix of some online as well as in-person contributions, just to make sure that we can spread this as widely as possible. So that's it from us, folks. Again, thank you to everybody. Thank you to all of you for spending time here today. Hope you found it really valuable and really useful. And we are almost approaching the end of this series. As I say, the next one is on the 17th of May. So that will be the last one for the time being. But I don't think it'll be the last time that we have conversations about this particular subject as we take this theme forward. So thanks, everyone, and look forward to seeing you again. Take care now.